three generous and loyal founding sponsors. They are Consolidated Edison, Verizon, and the law firm of Greenberg Traurig. They've been with us for many years, and we're delighted to continue to have the partnership with them. I also want to thank the individual contributors who voluntarily contribute when they sign up to attend the breakfast. Thank you. We are enormously grateful for this financial support that makes the CityLaw Breakfast series possible. Today's speaker is Michael Arad, the designer of the 9/11 Memorial. After Michael Arad's prepared remarks, we will have a question and comment session. We encourage you to submit a question or a comment at any time during the breakfast. We collect the questions as they come in. To submit a question or comment, please use the Q&A function on your Zoom screen. We ask that you please identify yourself with your first and last name and your organization. Following the Q&A session, we will close the breakfast with a colloquy between Michael Arad and Dean Anthony Crowell. New York Law School is only 8 blocks from Ground Zero. Our students and our faculty were all here that morning. In keeping with the law school's tradition of participating in ceremonies remembering 9/11, we welcome Michael Arad to New York Law School. Michael Arad was born in Israel, raised in London, and spent his high school years in Mexico City, where his father was the Israeli ambassador to Mexico. He entered Dartmouth College with the class of 1991 and then took time off to serve in the Israeli army. He graduated with the Dartmouth class of 1994. Arad later earned a master's degree in architecture from Georgia Tech. Arad came to New York City in 1999. He first lived on the Lower East Side, and from the roof of his building, he saw the second plane hit the South Tower of the World Trade Center. In 2003, while working for New York City Housing Authority, Michael Arad entered the contest for the design of the 9/11 Memorial. There were more than 5,000 entries. In 2004, the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation selected Michael Arad's design, and the 9/11 Memorial, with his design, opened to the public in 2011. New York Law School is honored to welcome Michael Arad to the CityLaw Breakfast Series. Michael Arad, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ross. It's an honor to be here, and I hate to start with a correction, but I was born in London. It's a funny story. My mother's family has actually been in Jerusalem for 5-6 generations, and I broke the chain, and almost as a joke, the hospital where I was born was leased for 24 hours by the embassy, so I could be born on Israeli soil, even though it was in London. My uncle actually was a law professor. He was asked if that actually had any legal standing, and he had to tell the students that, alas, no. So, but to go back to the topic at hand, the design of the memorial, and please let me know if you can see my screen. For me, this project began with my experiences here in New York, and my response to them was to begin sketching an idea for a memorial. And this was one of those first sketches. I imagined a memorial actually in the Hudson River. I imagined the surface of the river shorn open, forming 2 square voids, and the water cascading into these voids and never filling them up. That sense of rupture and absence that time doesn't heal. And I think I felt compelled to think about a memorial because of not just witnessing the attack, but witnessing how New York responded to that attack. And so I ended up taking that sketch and building a small model of it, a small fountain that captured that idea of tear in the surface of the water. And I took it up to the rooftop of my apartment building in the East Village, where I had witnessed the second plane strike the South Tower. And I could see the absence of those 2 towers in the skyline somehow mirrored and reflected in these 2 voids in the foreground. And I did this in 2002, 2003, before a competition was announced for the design of the site. In fact, prior to the competition for the design of the memorial, there was competition for the design of the master plan for the site. And you can see up here on the top left side of the screen, Daniel Libeskind's master plan, which restored the 16-acre super block, the site of the World Trade Center, back into the urban grid by letting Greenwich run through the site, running north-south, as well as Fulton running east-west. In effect, subdividing the 16-acre super block into 4 smaller blocks. The largest one, about 8 acres in size, was set aside for the memorial. As you can see in the materials here that were part of that competition brief. However, the master plan also called for the site of the actual footprints of the towers to be some 60 feet below the surrounding streets and sidewalks. An 8-acre depression in the middle of the city. And I thought about my own experiences in New York in the days and months that followed 9/11 and how important public space was to our response in the city. How our ability to go to places like Union Square and Washington Square and to stand together and to confront the horror and the evil that we had experienced together was, in my mind, key to the way in which we here in New York responded to the attack with stoicism, but with compassion. And I thought that when I looked at this master plan, this space did not look like other civic public spaces in New York. It felt disconnected from the city. And so almost as a polemical response, I sent in a proposal that suggested raising everything up to ground to the surrounding streets and sidewalks to create a civic public space that would connect to the urban fabric, that would be part of New York. And matching that idea of the civic public space with this idea of how do you mark loss and absence, with the voids that I had imagined in the Hudson River the year prior, could I bring them to the site to mark the footprints of the towers? And so you could see people standing around the voids, looking down at it, or perhaps behind the waterfall, looking past the names at the void beyond. The competition guidelines asked for a 30 by 40 inch board to be sent in at the end of June of 2003. And so on this board, I showed an image of that fountain I had previously designed and talked about the notions of making absence visible and tangible, and how this memorial would fit into the city. And the last few words in this description actually talk about people on their way to work or play, to suggest that this memorial had to serve multiple constituencies, that it could not just be a memorial that was there for visitors on that once-in-a-lifetime pilgrimage, but that it had to serve people who work in this neighborhood, who live in this neighborhood, who cross the site daily. And so you could see this plaza at grade punctured by these 2 large voids, and then a set of memorial galleries surrounding each void where one could stand behind the waterfall and encounter the names of the deceased. I was one of 8 finalists that the LMDC selected, and at that point in late 2003, I got to visit the site months after the recovery effort had ended. You could still see some of the parking slabs that had been below the World Trade Center plaza on the left side of the image. You could see this flurry wall, an artifact that had been hidden underground for over 30 years and became exposed during the recovery effort. And you could see these cut off steel columns that had connected the tower to its foundation. And in the recovery effort, these steel columns were torch cut with an acetylene torch, leaving this jagged, rough mark behind. And you could put a new steel box column here and erase in some way the history of what happened here. And I saw something very eloquent in this absence and tried to capture it in this design. I had a month to prepare additional materials for a review by the jury and the LMDC staff. And these materials are from that time period, imagining the materiality of the stone that would ring the fountains and the underfoot, the ramps that would lead you down from light through darkness and up to the edge of the pool, back to light, where one would encounter the hundreds of names that surround each pool and see the city beyond, see this empty space, almost an acre in size, marking the footprint of the towers as a threshold of sort, a line that you could walk up to but not cross, a line separating the living from the dead, the present from the past. And a place of enormous significance. I think this is at the heart of the experience of visiting this memorial, this encounter with a name. And the return to the plaza changed by that journey. The jury looked at these materials and said, you talk about this site being very much a living part of the city, yet this landscape design that we see with these tall eastern white pine trees still feels very sparse, very much as if it's dedicated solely to memorial use, and challenge us to, and at this point I brought on Peter Walker to join my team, to think of how we could treat the landscape design in a way that would enliven that plaza. And my concern was, how do we do that without undercutting that first and primary gesture of the flat plane and the two voids? And we came up with this idea that we called abacus-like bands, where the trees are arranged in rows at random intervals, the same way that beads could slide along the wires of an abacus and stop here or there, but along a line. And I came back to the jury with this rendering and this model and presented to them. And in early January of 2004, they selected the design, and we went to work on realizing this design in all of its various aspects, from the most sacred and difficult, such as where the unidentified remains might be stored. And this was an idea we had explored at the time, that they would be in a vessel below one of the central voids, to the much more quotidian concerns. Where would school groups gather? Where would the information desk be? Where would bathrooms be located? One of the first tasks that we tackled was the engineering behind the waterfall. Would we do something like you see here at Paley Park, where the water clings to the surface of the wall and is agitated through a roughly textured wall and the use of a lot of water rushing over that wall? Or would we do something that is more akin to what you see here at the World Financial Center, Brookfield Place now, where the water falls off the edge of a weir and free falls down to the pool below? And we ended up choosing that second option, in part because we wanted the line, the splash line from the water, to be further away from the memorial galleries and the visitors. We tested the fountain in our fountain designer's backyard in Toronto, Canada, in the winter and in the summer. And water is one of those materials that you can't scale down how it behaves. You have to test everything full scale with the materials that you're using. And so these are studies of various profiles for the serration along the edge of the weir. And what came out of this investigation, this design process, was a design where you can see clearly each and every strand of water as it comes off the edge of the weir and separates into individual streams. But as it falls down some 30 feet, halfway down, the clarity of each individual line dissipates, and you have this woven tapestry of water, bringing all these separate lines together. And the idea of commemorating both individual and communal loss was something that was always in my mind, but I had no idea that we would find a way to sort of bring it to the foreground through this part of the design. We were working on the design of bronze panels that would list the names of the deceased, and you can imagine what it would be like to stand in that memorial gallery looking at these panels, looking through this sheer curtain of water at the city beyond. For a variety of reasons, having to do with security concerns, budget overruns, and simply struggles with other projects that were being built on the site, we were told that the memorial galleries had to be removed from the design and that the names would have to be brought up to plaza level. This photograph of a firefighter kneeling at the edge of one of the temporary reflecting pools that was built at the site every year for the commemoration ceremony captured for me what I had hoped visitors to the memorial would feel in these memorial galleries, because it was a space that would shelter that almost spiritual, almost religious moment of encounter. And when those memorial galleries were eliminated, I found myself standing at the edge of the void, not knowing what would we put there, how would we arrange the names to capture that. This is at the Brooklyn Navy Yards, where we built a lot of our mock-ups. And you can see one idea that we pursued for over a year, which was the end of the paving of the plaza on the right, the beginning of a water feature the names breaking the surface of the water, and a submerged guardrail that would prevent people from falling into the void beyond. We pursued this direction for close to a year when a determination was made that it posed a risk in and of itself. And we were asked to create another design that actually was 42 inches above plaza level. And you can imagine the scrutiny and pressure that we were under during this period. People went from it's too soon to discuss the memorial to collectively saying, why is it taking so long? And this design concept that we worked on was creating a sort of a bronze vessel that the names would be inscribed upon. Rivulets of water would trickle across the front of this vessel, almost like tears across the names, and a torrent of water would fall across the other side, something that whispered in one direction and was loud in another. This too was rejected. But I do think that the memorial that you see on the plaza today has been informed by every iteration and every study and every investigation that we engaged in over these years. And it is an 8-foot wide and 2-foot tall water table that rings the void. And then floating above that is a bronze wing that comes to that height of 42 inches. That bronze wing has the names are cut out of it, and they appear as shadows during the day. And at night, this panel is illuminated from within and the names appear as light. How the names appear on these panels is probably the most emotionally difficult and charged question of this entire design process. I had proposed initially something I had called meaningful adjacency, and that idea was rejected. The idea of reaching out to family members and asking them if there were names of other people who perished that day that they would like to see next to the name of the person that they lost. And the LMBC at the time was in charge of the process prior to handing it over to the Memorial Foundation, and they had interactions with dozens of different family groups that were unhappy with how they were administering the recovery downtown. And so when I asked them to reach out to each and every family group, there was a lot of reluctance to do that. And I was told it would be impossible to implement and that we should come up with another way of arranging the names. And I could not think of another way to arrange names that wouldn't inadvertently bring some names together and separate others. Some families that shared a last name would be listed next to each other, and other families that didn't would not be listed next to each other if you relied on something as simple as an alphabetical listing. An alphabetical listing wouldn't distinguish between people who share the same first and last name, and there are 3 Michael Lynches on this memorial. So there had to be a way to create a place that belonged to each individual, and not this competing proposal that we had to contend with, which was to arrange names by employer, by listing them alphabetically by employer, along with the floor that they were on and their age. And it felt almost like it did not feel like it gave each name an individual place, but rather one in a group, in a tally. And so even graphically, the idea of stacking names in columns versus letting each name have its own place was important to me. When Mayor Bloomberg became chairman of the Memorial Foundation in 2006, this was one of the first issues that he wanted to address, the names arrangement. It had actually brought fundraising for the memorial to a complete standstill. And we decided to arrange the names into 9 broad groups, which reflected where people were geographically that day: the 4 flights, the 2 towers, and the Pentagon. The first responders in turn are grouped by where they came from the same firehouse or the same precinct building. But the mayor was open to the idea of reintroducing the idea of meaningful adjacency into the design within the rubric of these 9 geographical groups. And some of these groups have hundreds of names in them. And so letters went out to family members asking them to verify how they would like to see the name of their loved one spelled, whether a nickname would be used or not, but also if there were any meaningful adjacency requests that they wanted to share with us. And we got over 1,200 requests. And we began this process without really knowing how we would, how successful we would be in implementing this request. We arranged the names by hand. One person in our office, her name is Amanda Sack, spent months and months printing every name at a quarter scale that it appears at the Memorial Foundation and trying to meet each and every adjacency request. And even when no adjacency request was made, we reached out to friends and coworkers and asked them if for information, who sat next to whom, who worked with whom, so that the names would be grouped together in a hidden web of connection. And it was a remarkably satisfying day when we figured out that we would be able to meet each and every adjacency request. And to most visitors to the memorial, I think this is an invisible order and they are not aware that it is there. But for family members, it is incredibly meaningful when they come to the site and see that. And when you understand the nature behind these requests and that information is shared with visitors, and it is shared with visitors right now through StoryCorps recordings that the memorial has done that you can pull up on your phone when you're standing in front of a particular panel. It changes your appreciation of the memorial. One of the requests we got was from the family of a young woman who lost her father, who was on Flight 11, and lost her best friend from college, who was working at the North Tower. Her father's name is the last one under Flight 11. Her friend's name is the first one under World Trade Center. And they're side by side, just at that joint between one group and another along the North Pool. And when you hear the story of this young woman, I think instead of grappling with the abstraction of close to 3,000 dead, you think about a very particular person and the experience that they had in the aftermath of this attack. We were well on our way to completing the memorial when the mayor's office of people with disabilities approached us and said people who are seated in wheelchairs, especially short-statured ones, wouldn't be able to see the void at the center of each pool while seated in a wheelchair. And I explained that we had to have a 42-inch high guardrail here for code reasons. And the most important thing was being able to touch the names, but they were unconvinced and said the totality of that experience had to be shared. And we started to try and modify the design to allow for that to happen. Here you see an idea of cutting slots through the names panels that would allow for that downward directed gaze. But these design ideas didn't really feel like they were appropriate or in the grammar of the design that we had developed. And I'm incredibly grateful that we were given the time to sort of formulate the appropriate design response under a lot of pressure. And it was people like Amanda Burden and Kate Levin, who worked for the Mayor Bloomberg at the time, that oversaw this process and gave us the time to respond. And the idea that we came up with was to actually chamfer the corners of the pools, to bring somebody who is seated in a wheelchair closer to the edge of the weir and to allow them a view of that secondary void at the center of each pool. And then we realized the towers had chamfered corners, and in some way we were echoing the past by doing that. And we went to the MOPD, Mayor's Office of People with Disabilities, very proud of having developed this idea. And they said, well, not everybody can turn their neck sideways to see the void, which felt like, oh my God, but hey, we had already cut the corner in plan, why not cut it also in sections so it actually cantilevers out almost like the prow of a ship. And in doing so, we actually created this ability to transition from 5 rows of names to 3 and then back to 5 to create a closed circle of names around the memorial pools, which was much more poetically appropriate. And I bring this up to say that design always is how do you respond to a set of constraints on any project. Typically it's, schedule and budget, but here there were many other concerns which were much more important. But that is, I think, at the heart of what a designer does. How do you respond to a set of constraints? And although we did not welcome this request, I think the memorial is better for having grappled with it and finding a solution to it, both visually and obviously programmatically, but also poetically. We opened the memorial almost 10 years ago tomorrow. And, what appears like terra firma in the middle of the city is actually green roof above a very complicated set of infrastructure and other program uses, the museum, the chiller plant, a mall, a subway line, path train to New Jersey. But all of that complexity is suppressed and is not telegraphed up. For me, I think the memorial is a place where you can look to see the past, to see what is absent. And I wanted to share a few images with you from the day that the memorial was dedicated. A day that was very challenging to be on the memorial, as much as it was rewarding to see families interacting with this design for the first time. And these two little girls running around and this father who just found his name, these two events, two moments in time happened very close to one another physically. And to me, that's appropriate and what I would hope the design could accomplish. If I would have shown you this presentation 2 years ago, I would have stopped here. But the memorial has changed, and in part because it failed to answer a need that we did not anticipate, which is a number of people who have grown ill. Over 1,000 have died. Thousands more will die of 9/11 related illnesses they contracted in Lower Manhattan, many while coming to the site as rescue and recovery workers. But neighborhood residents, high school kids who went to Stuyvesant, there's just the number of people who have been stricken by these illnesses is vast. And the memorial failed to address that in any way. It was not an omission that was intentional, but a few years ago, I heard from a woman who was involved in the recovery effort, and she had grown ill, how she did not feel that there was a place on the memorial that belonged to her community. And it was hard to hear that. And so we were tasked to address that wrong. And we created a memorial glade that is dedicated to all of these people. And, unlike the names that surround the pool, we do not have a list of all the people who have been stricken by these illnesses, and we cannot commemorate those who are still with us but are suffering. And so it would have to be a very different memorial, and it would also have to sort of establish its own sense of place and autonomy, but also be part of the sort of larger ensemble of the World Trade Center Memorial. And so I was drawn to the memorial glade that had existed since we opened the memorial at the southwest portion of the plaza, but was very much not in use in the day-to-day life of the memorial. It is a series of paving bands and grass strips. And during the year, people are prohibited from walking on them. And only once a year on September 11 would it be open to the public. And it was gratifying to see the public use it on that day, but it felt like this area where the trees are sort of pulled back and you can stand under the open sky was the right place to explore in addition to the memorial. And so we thought about creating a path through here. And the Memorial Plaza is characterized very much by this, how flat it is, so that those two voids really stand out. And I was drawn to something that would actually kind of break that flatness, sort of erupt up and in some way exhibit a sense of forceful resistance, which is what I associated with the story of the recovery. And so we started to explore ideas of something that would break and sort of erupt out of the surface of the plaza, that would be sort of beaten and bruised, but strong and resilient. And it became a series of these monoliths and a new path that you would walk through this space. And this process engaged a lot of the recovery workers who were involved in this. And one thing that became clear was how important World Trade Center steel was to them too. It had a sort of almost emblematic quality to it. And so we were asked to use World Trade steel almost to bind together these slabs of stone that form these monoliths. And so a few pictures from the fabrication process of what looks like natural cleft stone, but isn't. The steel being poured for these sinews that kind of tie together these stone slabs. And here you can see a photograph of the Memorial Glade shortly after it was dedicated, on the day that it was dedicated. And just seeing, how people interact with the memorial, all these hands on that stone and the steel, was incredibly powerful and moving to me. I just want to share one last thing before we jump to Q&A. I was asked to design a temporary COVID memorial recently, and was drawn to the New York City Reservoir at Central Park that when the water is drained there a few feet, submerged dam that subdivides the reservoir becomes visible. And I thought of the notion of creating a temporary memorial that once a year in March for a week becomes visible. It's a place where we can go and commemorate those we have lost. Sort of an island where you can go alone or with a couple of friends or with a group and form your own set of rituals, a place where you can be in New York, but away from the city simultaneously. So thank you. And I wanted to end on this note that I think public space is important because it informs us who we are and our sense of identity. And I think that is an important civic quality that architecture has a responsibility to further. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was really moving, and listen to you tell the journey of the design and construction of the memorial is extremely moving, and I thank you for doing that and for sharing your thoughts with us. Questions and comments have been collected by Brian Kasuba, the Associate Director of the Center for New York City Law, and we thank him and the staff of the Center, particularly Lillian Santiago, for managing these sessions and getting out all the emails to all of the people who are participating and in the webinar, and we thank them both. We also thank the law school for the terrific work in putting together these breakfasts. Brian, what's the first question or comment?
Thank you, Ross, and thank you, Michael, for a moving presentation. So right now we have one question. Please, if anyone else wants to ask, please. Oh, good, see them coming through now. First question is from Walter Palmer. Walter Palmer is from Dartmouth College. He asks, did the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C. affect your ideas? And if so, how?
Of course it did. It's one of the seminal works of 20th century architecture, and it's a memorial that I visited a number of times. I actually spent a few years living in the city. So I think what is remarkable about that memorial is how it engages people physically as well as emotionally, right? When you descend and you are confronted by the names in your reflection, and you stand there and you see the city around you and everything and the debt that we owe those whose names are on that memorial. So, so yes, I think any architect working today has been influenced by that project.
Great. Next question is from Carl Holtzschuh, class of '59. Did the memorial in the CP Reservoir get built? When is it to open? Oh, no, it hasn't been built. It was, so New York Magazine reached out to me and they reached out to a number of people asking for designs for a temporary COVID memorial. And I think the notion that it would be temporary felt appropriate to me because we're still in the midst of this pandemic. But I'm sure many people are already thinking about it because of the losses that they have suffered. I would hope that it could be built, but it would require a tremendous amount of political will for something like that to be realized. Okay, we don't have any other questions at the moment. We'll see if anyone else has questions. Jean Anthony Crowell, would you like to come on? Oh, here's a quick question. Here we go. And please keep the questions coming. Oz Yangus is a student at Eugene Lang College of Liberal Arts. He's an up-and-coming journalist, and his question is, how did you properly convey everyone's grief in one space? Was it difficult or a straightforward process?
So I'm not sure I agree with the premise of the question. I don't think I could properly convey everyone's grief. I think that is a task that that would be impossible. I do think that what I tried to do is create a space that allows people to disengage to some degree from their day-to-day life while they're here. And it's not a complete separation from that day-to-day life. It is at a juncture between commemoration and life, which I think is characteristic of grief, right? It is, and I think different people will have different responses to visiting the memorial. But I think if there is no response, that is a failure of design. But whether that response is a sense of closure and consolation, or whether that response is a sense of frustration and anger, those are a range of responses that I can imagine people having.
Great. Next question is from Sky Day. Sky Day from Rensselaer Polytech Institute architect student. Do you feel that the public has respected this space on the level it needs to be, or needs to be appreciated more in respect to those who've lost their lives?
I think for the most part, yes, the public has respected this place. I think there are always, incidents where you wish people would behave more respectfully. I mean, the question earlier about the Vietnam veterans, well, I remember seeing it years ago when a group of high school students were kind of being led through there, and they were kind of jostling each other. And we design spaces with the intent of conveying how we hope people use them, but we can't prescribe, not a police state, and we can't tell people exactly what they should feel and how they should walk or talk or dress. And I think that's part of any civic space. So I think the lack of civic spaces is what creates, I think, less and less of a sense of how we need to occupy them. And I think the answer is to create more of them.
We have a few more questions coming through, and I appreciate to see a lot of the questions are from people from out of state. The beauty of having a Zoom webinar as opposed to in person is we've been able to publicize this throughout the country, not just locally. So although we'd love to see you all in person, hopefully you can do that soon. We're glad that we've been able to include many more followers today. So next question is coming from Asheville, North Carolina, from Wendy Wheat, retired Peace Corps. She says, "Thank you, Michael. Your presentation has moved me to tears. I would be interested in how the whole process personally affected you. Any specific stories or incidents? Thank you for your time."
I started this process when I was much younger, and I think I was 35. And I'm now 52, and it was a growing experience. And I feel that I began this with a very sort of headstrong, zeal, that what was shown to the jury I had to deliver, and probably antagonized a few people along the way. And when those memorial galleries, which I had shown earlier in the presentation, were removed from the design, it felt like the whole design disappeared. And it took me some time to come to terms with the fact that the design that I had proposed initially in 2003 with its memorial galleries was really based on fundamental ideas which guided me, which were the creation of a civic public space at grade that would be linked to the city and be part of it, and the creation of a memorial that would not try to erase the loss, but actually to make that absence tangible and visible and present. And that as long as I could find a way to hold on to those two foundational principles, we could find a way to change the physical aspect of the memorial, like those memorial galleries, into something different. And, as a young architect, I think you don't necessarily have the confidence to believe that the idea alone is what's important. You think, but, I modeled it and I drew it and I rendered it and I could see it in my mind's eye. I could see where every joint in the concrete was going to be. Yet, what was much more important were the ideas. And we were able to find a way to hold on to those ideas and not make this memorial an altogether different thing as a result of the loss of those memorial galleries. And in some ways, I think, and I would never want to, to have lost these galleries, but I think the memorial is stronger for having the names at plaza level, where you stand there and you are connected to the city while being sheltered by the space, by the trees, by the distances around it. So that the experience of first seeing the pools and seeing the names is now joined and not separated. So I would say that's how I've been changed in that way by this experience. And I've been, fortunate to be asked to come back and design this addition to the memorial, which was so a huge privilege and responsibility to come back and to address what was not addressed there. And you find that you can do it from a place of including people in the conversation and listening and trusting that the process will yield something. Because I think there's always the fear of an empty page, a blank page. What are we going to do? Then things, for the most part, can work out from a design standpoint.
Great. Next question is from Vicky Weinberg Singer from Dartmouth College, class of 91. Hi, Michael. What are your current projects?
I am working actually on, here at the office, we do a lot of residential and institutional work, but every once in a while you get a project that is especially meaningful. And I'm working on a memorial in Charleston right now at the Mother Emanuel Church to commemorate the 9 who were killed by white supremacists there in 2015. And that project we're hoping to dedicate by June of 2023. And it's been an incredibly moving journey to be part of that design. In fact, when they reached out to me to participate in this process, it wasn't by soliciting a design, by asking to engage in a conversation on the nature of forgiveness and how. And so I would love to direct everyone here to look at that memorial at emmanuel9.org. And you can contribute there to that design.
Great. Next question is from Mr. Cohen, Scott Cohen. What was the single most important design idea that you personally wanted to see included, but was not?
So I think we actually kept the main design ideas. And I think that's what kept this project true to itself. It could have become a very different memorial in tone and tenor. It could have been much more, consumed with pity or with aggression, and what I wanted to do is bring forth the qualities that I saw here in New York in the aftermath of the attack, which was a sense of stoicism leavened with compassion. It was the people who perpetrated this attack, I think, wanted to sow fear and division, and they were completely, they failed at that. I've never seen this country more united and had seen it in the aftermath of that attack.
Next question is from Mark Diller, a community board member in New York City. The memorial space is both a highly local focal point of individuals' grief and a statement to the international community of our nation's response to the attack. The outreach to families is particularly noteworthy. Please describe how all the audiences for the memorial affected your design journey.
It was literally dozens, if not hundreds of conversations over years, and friendships that formed, and people who told me I was completely wrong to do something, who in some cases said, that this came out much better than I had expected. I think there's a lot of fear involved in any design and construction process, because until you are there and experience it, it's very hard just by looking at a drawing or a rendering to really understand what it's going to be like. And to me, over the last few years, what's been remarkable is how the site here at the 9/11 Memorial has become such a part of New York. right? It was not part of New York for such a long time. And when we first opened it, there was a sense of, a newness and almost strangeness to something. And over time, it kind of just, the strangeness of a place, the newness of it disappears and it becomes part of its context. And I don't know that always happens. Some things might always feel out of place, but to me, when I see the memorial now, it feels like such a part of the city, and that is very gratifying.
Thank you, Michael. And before I invite Dean Crowell to come up, personally want to thank you for what you've done as someone who knew someone who lost their lives that day, and then visiting the memorial to pay respects. We appreciate what you've accomplished for our whole community. Dean Crowell.
Thanks so much, Brian, and it's nice to see you again, Michael. When I was Mayor Bloomberg's counsel, we had some interaction regarding that disability access, among other things. I worked closely with Mike and Patty on this, and your work is truly incredible. And I, as someone who ran the 9/11 death certificate program out of Pier 94, I'm very close to this issue, and having witnessed the second plane hit the South Tower as you witnessed it from your rooftop. It's a very meaningful space to me personally, and being so close to the law school now, I go there frequently when it's open and reflect. As a law school, and given my personal experience, I want to get some insight from you on some aspects of public process and some of the legal challenges that you had to overcome. Certainly, I think a theme that came up from your presentation is one of inclusion. And obviously, in anything one does to do justice to a community that is so grief-stricken by this tragedy, this attack, and your commitment to public space, there's a process that has to attend to making sure you understand everything and you capture as much as you can. Can you give us a little bit of the insight as to the public process an architect undertakes to bring something like this to fruition?
Yes, and I agree with you. It has to be a public process, and it's not just the 9/11 memorial. I think it's the entire World Trade Center site that for years was under criticism for the pace at which things moved, the fact that there were so many different entities with different interests. They couldn't seem to come to any agreement as to what should be done. But I think what was remarkable about the redevelopment of Lower Manhattan, the World Trade Center site, was that almost anybody could express their voice. And some people had a much bigger soapbox that they could stand on and much more power, like the governor and the mayor. But there were many people that had no network of power brokers behind them. They simply had passion in their heart over the loss of a loved one or something else that drove them like that, and expressed their views and became part of this sort of, I think it was described by some people as cacophony, but I actually think it was a process that we got the best results out of because there were so many views involved in it. And you can look at other, comparably sized developments in Manhattan, for example, where you had people who got to design by fiat, let's say Hudson Yards, for example, that feel like they're not part of New York. And I don't think they will ever be a real part of New York. And so, I think that process that engages a multiplicity of voices can be messy and angry and slow. But if you don't have all of these voices, it's like, what's that fable about the kid that said that, the king is naked, right? I mean, if you don't have somebody that says this is a terrible idea, and somebody hears it and says, you know what, it is a terrible idea, then we should do something else, then people can proceed on their way without anybody saying this isn't right. And so, I don't think that there's a magical formula. I think very often we pine for the days where somebody like Robert Moses could just say, we're going to do something here and move forward, especially as we see infrastructure failing all over the country. So you can't be paralyzed by everybody speaking all the time. But if you don't have a process that allows everybody to say something at some point, then the results are just going to be poor.
Yeah. Give us a little bit of insight into how much you worked personally with the families and what some of those interactions were like, because I know that I know from personal experience, incredibly challenging sets of perspectives. And you talked about the placement of the names, because I know that was a subject of great community concern and dispute. And that was just a small part of the overall effect that needed to be vetted and then brought to life. Can you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, and I might not have been even clear enough in my description that when I said the LMDC rejected the meaningful adjacency, for 2 years, the counter proposal that was on the table was to have no meaning to the names arrangement, which was an incredibly difficult thing to propose. I proposed it with such a heavy heart because I knew that there were families that traveled together on the planes, families, fathers and sons or brothers that worked together in the towers. And the proposal to let the names fall where they may would separate them. And if it upset me, you can only imagine how much it upset family members. So, you know, and it brought fundraising and construction on the project to a standstill, you know, as it should have. And so here's another instance of, you know, engagement and I think it was that fear by LMDC of like reaching out to all the families and saying, you know, participate in this process. And I credit Mayor Bloomberg with letting us do that. Most politicians, right? Like, let's say we get 100 requests and we're able to answer 50 of them. Now you have 50 people who feel that they were robbed of something that somebody else got. And so it was a tremendous risk to even try this. It would have been much simpler to say, we're just going to arrange it alphabetically and geographically or something like that. So it takes trust by all parties and a willingness to engage. And a lot of the family groups that by the time that we were talking to them had already been involved in a process that was years in the making, where they felt that they were not acknowledged, that they were not being listened to, you know, by people who were in power. And so I think the sooner you bring people into dialogue, the better the result can be.
You know, what do you know, and that process was undertaken a long time ago. What do you think it would look like today in the world of social media, with the proliferation of tweeting and Facebook? And while that was around at the time, it was not as ubiquitous. And I have often wondered, what does a public process that is so deeply personal, yet so the enormity of it is so important. What do you think it would look like today? And how would you manage something like that if you had to build another design and build another memorial?
Yeah, so you're talking to a Luddite. I actually stopped using Facebook a few years ago, and what happened recently, in the last few years around, it just feels like such a toxic environment that doesn't foster anything positive coming out of it. And, you know, I've heard comparisons of, you know, public space having some sort of digital equivalent, as if, you know, there's a virtual public space. I don't think there is a virtual public space. I think what we have are virtual isolation chambers rather than a shared environment. So you know, I talked earlier about being young then and older now. And in this instance, I do feel like an old fogey a little bit, but I think what you get in these environments is people hardening around their own sets of truth and facts, and it becomes much more balkanized and us versus them. And I think that's why I ended my presentation today talking about civic shared public space, because I think that is so important in creating an identity that we share with others, in the sense that, you know, we are not alone, that we're part of a city, they were part of a nation. And I can go back to 2-3 nights after the attack, living in Lower Manhattan. Everything south of 14th Street was cordoned off, and I couldn't sleep. And I got on my bike and I was biking around what felt like a ghost town. And I found my way to Washington Square Park, and I walked up to the edge of that fountain. There were a dozen or so people there, a few candles, no ceremony, no MC. And when I walked up to the edge of that fountain and stood next to a complete stranger, you know, nothing had to be said. Like, I felt for the first time like a New Yorker. I felt connected. I felt that everyone who was standing around that fountain with me, we were there together. And I don't think you get that on Facebook or Instagram. I don't think, you know, a tweet will ever capture the depth of that emotion and connection.
You talk about at a time when you were younger, and you and I are the same age. What advice do you give to young architects? And similarly, what would you give to young lawyers who seek to do justice in their various careers, in terms of how to advocate and represent important moments that have happened in our society?
I think, you know, be engaged is the first thing. Care and work and go out there and put the effort in. You know, I think just showing up is 95% of it, right? And finding allies and realizing like that you're not alone with this viewpoint, but also be, you know, patient and kind and listen to other people too, who might have a very different viewpoint than you. I think it's easy for us to sort of form a sort of it's us versus them on almost any issue nowadays. And I actually think there's a lot more that unites us than divides us. And, you know, it's important to remember that.
Great. Thanks. Appreciate your being with us today and all the extraordinary contributions you've made to all our lives with your work, and that you'll continue to do the same thing is inspiring. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
I want to join and bring this session to a close. It was a wonderful session. I want to thank Anthony and Michael for a great colloquy and all the people who asked questions from so many far away. I also want to thank Michael particularly for speaking with us, and I felt a great human spirit behind the great memorial. And I thank you for what you did for New York City and for all of us. Thank you all for attending the breakfast. We'll be back next month. Thank you so much.